Genuine conversations with unique minds on the threats, the complexity, and the geopolitics shaping our world. This is the Entropy Podcast with Francis Gorman.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Entropy Podcast. I'm your host, Francis Gorman. Before we dive in, if today's conversation challenges you, sparks a new idea, or sharpens how you think about the world, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who enjoys staying curious. Today I'm joined by Shayne De la Force, a veteran strategy leader who has spent his career on the front lines of the world's most complex technology sectors. With deep hands-on experience in semiconductor and advanced manufacturing industries, Shayne has developed and executed growth strategies across the critical innovation hubs of Asia, Europe, and Australia. Now based in Washington, D.C., USA, Shayne brings a rare global perspective to the challenges of commercializing deep tech. Shayne, it's lovely to have you here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Frank. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you, Shayne, and I suppose I'm looking forward to this conversation because of your background and your expertise, and you bring a slightly different angle to the world than I focused on, particularly, especially in the quantum space. And on that, you founded LFI on a belief that quantum will reshape the economics of advanced manufacturing before companies are ready to govern it. What's the strongest evidence you've seen that this is already happening?
Yeah, great question. Happening and going to be happening over the time. I think we're actually getting ready for that happening as part of it. Now, obviously, that's a big question in terms of whether we're talking about quantum computing, quantum sensing, quantum communications, and then looking at it from the different angles of what that actually looks like. So, and you can get a different angle or a different answer to that question depending on who you're talking to, the target audience, and what that actually means. But our take on it is purely economics, and ultimately, unless you're working for a not-for-profit, we're all here to drive business and to drive growth, and economic growth and what that looks like. If you're a CEO or a CFO in a business, your main goal is to drive economic value while reducing economic risk or overall risk. And it's pretty simple, keeping it into those two categories of overall. And then what can we actually do, and what can the CEO or CFO or the C-suite actually do to maximize economic value for the business with their products and services, and also reduce the different risks that are actually coming at the business on there. And there's multiples, on all of it. And it's juggling all of those different levers, growth levers and risk levers at once, in order of priority to maximize the value of that business. So for us, when we look at the value creation and all the modeling that we've actually done, what we can actually see is the economic value that's going to come from quantum is massive. And especially if you look at, you take history as an example, and look at the major areas of industry 1.0, where we're working on the farms, to industry 2.0, then industry 3.0, where predominantly we are, and we're starting to get automation going in. The value creation from the different industrial areas is massive, and especially when we start working towards industry 6.0 or industry 5.0, 6.0, and beyond. And that's going far into the future right now. But the value creation of those particular eras going forward is massively increasing exponentially over time. And also the first period of industry 1.0 was about 110 years. Industry 2.0 was about 95 years. Industry 3.0 is about 25 years. And we're expecting, industry 5.0 and 6.0 to be less than 10 years. Going through that, but yet the value creation from that, learning from history and looking forward in terms of the numbers are going to be pretty staggering.
I love all this economics pieces when you start kind of breaking it down, like Sean.
Sorry, I geek out on the numbers.
Don't worry, I appreciate it, especially I'm trying to remember what book I read, but like someone who was 13 in the next decade we'll see something like 60 years change in a week or so. Something incredible was I can't remember the exact step, but it's just that kind of the compression you're talking about there. We went 100 years down to kind of 20, and then we're 10, like, and
Yeah.
after that cycle, what's it gonna look like? And I suppose when we're talking economics and we're talking quantum, what's the cost of being unprepared? Is there a dollar competitive or enterprise value lens we can put on it, Shane?
Yeah, there absolutely is. There's a dollar figure we can put on waiting from a risk perspective, especially when we're looking at. We'll get into a little bit deeper, I'm sure, later on. But in terms of waiting, so what's that risk in terms of IP, in terms of your intellectual property and your data loss of your long term data? What is that? That has a cost on it, and it's very easy to calculate what that actual cost is. But then there's also the cost of waiting in terms of preparation for what is actually coming. Those companies that are moving today are the ones that are going to have the highest competitive moat when it goes through here, because ultimately we always use the analogy of building a bridge, and that's what we're trying to do with quantum, is building a bridge to maximize the economic value while reducing risk for a particular company going forward. But in order to build a solid bridge, you need to actually have the plan, your engineering plans on what that looks like. You need to actually make sure it's built on your solid foundations, and that's your cybersecurity, quantum security side of things. Then you need to actually start adding value. You want cars to go across your bridge. You start with one lane, test it, make sure that that one car can get across the actual bridge in the shortest amount of time. And then, working on quantum advantage down the path there of making sure then you've got an 8-lane freeway and all of that. So yes, you can absolutely put numbers, and you must put numbers across each of the different segments of the bridge, let's say, that you're actually crossing. And
I
create.
like I like the analogy of the bridge, and the expansion of the bridge, and then the purpose of the bridge with the cars running across it, and the trucks, the lorries, or whatever else is needed to get the kind of quantum advantage. Are are boards making decisions today in terms of quantum governance that they don't even realize are quantum decisions, or are going to cause issues in the future?
Yeah, yes and no. It's still very early days, and that's what we're finding. We're spending a lot of time on is talking to boards worldwide in the industrial space and actually explaining to them what all this actually means. As a board member myself on different boards, but also from a business perspective and talking to a lot of the boards, there's a level of awareness that doesn't exist yet around it. Where everybody is obsessed with AI right now, and that's sort of sucking all the air out of the room in a lot of ways, and then being able to have that conversation. But the whole conversation here, once again, is once you put those economic numbers around it, and also from a board perspective, they have fiduciary requirements to minimize the risk and understanding what that risk of quantum technologies are. So I would say we're at the early days of education with the boards, and that's also where we're spending a lot of time. If we can start with the boards and then work our way through the actual business, I think that's going to be the best path forward for most businesses, because unless you've got buy-in at the top, it's very hard to go through the rest. Even by the even if you can bottom up or whatever, and within the hierarchy, a CISO needs their support, the budget, and the resources in order to be able to move through this. And for that, they need the C-suite on board. The C-suite needs the actual board on site as well. So to answer your question, we're getting there. We're starting, and I think having that conversation with boards, industrial boards, advanced manufacturers around the world is actually starting to have it resonates once they hear the message. Absolutely. And then their job is to put that in order of priority of all the many, many priorities that they've actually got. Ultimately, risk is a calculation that every business needs to actually make based on the risk of everything else they've got going on, macro and microeconomic factors and everything else. And so where does that risk fall into all the other risks that they're actually working on today? And what will that actually look like? I think there's a lot of organizations that are very slow to move, and we've got big organizations like Google's announcement in 2029. We got Cloudflare, Microsoft, and I think that's a great start to showing companies on that we're actually moving and getting forward, and why we actually need that. But we're starting at LFI and having that conversation with boards with a number. And this, looking at the risk number, what's the economic risk of losing all your IP and your long-term data today? And that's usually when the needle starts moving, and when their eyes start lighting up and going, oh crap. That oh crap moment is always what we want.
Crap. If we get a no crap, we're good.
Yes.
Shayne, I'm interested because you're talking to a lot of manufacturing industry type corporations, etc. Obviously, I spend a lot of time in the financial sector, and the mobilization effort there is quite coordinated, quite pointed, and a lot of cross contamination between ideas in that space that are being shared, and are forming the roadmaps for different banks and other types of credit facilities across Europe and America and Canada and beyond. The manufacturing space to me doesn't seem like an obvious candidate to get quantum ready. Can you why did you go after that one first? Can you talk to me about that?
Great question. So it's my background. I started off in I graduated university in Osaka, Japan, and then went straight into the semiconductor business for living in Japan for nearly 15 years there. So I've started my career in deep tech and continue that conversation and in one form or another through advanced manufacturing and deep tech in there. The reason in terms of LFI and there is not just actually because of my background or my technology or my network in that particular area, but it's also when we talk about it, we're talking about advanced manufacturing. And so what are those main sectors that fall within advanced industry for us? We have the semiconductor industry, we have the aerospace industry, we have the defense industry, we have automotive as a starting point. Now, you think of those four particular sectors within advanced manufacturing or advanced industry, and they all are at the bleeding edge in terms of compute and what's actually happening right now in terms of compute. They're leading the way, but also predominantly all four of these actually have government mandates looming over their heads or about to loom. Obviously we had the US government rolling back their CMMC this week, phase 2. But I think that's just actually a little bit of a pause in terms of what's actually going to happen. But all four of these sectors are, have government mandates. They all are at the bleeding edge of compute and what they're actually doing in that area, where quantum can actually have huge potential value creation for them. And so that was sort of the actual reasoning in terms of where we're actually focusing on that. That being said, also, when you look at the other sectors like finance, like you're actually saying, pharma, chemical, there's massive value creation possible in those areas as well. And I think some of those industries, for example, finance sector is well and truly ahead of us in the advanced industrials, but we're going to catch up, and we're moving in that process, but getting that consolidation, singular voice for the industry going forward as well is going to be really important for us. But we've got some catching up to do to the finance industry.
No, it's great. I'm just super interested in it. But then when you start saying, aviation, I was like, oh yeah, okay, maybe, maybe those guys do want to be on top of it, yeah. So no, that's a great insight, Shayne. I was looking at your company website and doing a bit of background research, and I came across the virtual chief quantum officer. Can you tell me who needs a virtual chief quantum officer and what that kind of remit is? I'm assuming it's an executive level role that slots into an organization where there's a gap.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. Embedded Chief Quantum Officer is really, when we actually look at technology change and what that actually looks like. For example, when I started off in the semiconductor industry, you would buy the actual compute power you needed, whether it's a CPUs or GPUs, and actually, you would embed it on premise and go in there, and you would actually bring all the talent and resources in-house as well. If you're a tier one, your Lockheed Martins, your Airbus, your that size where you're actually a prime, you're going to have the internal resources. Lockheed Martin have a quantum team of quite a sizable quantum team in house. So does Airbus. So does all the other major primes are developing as well. But when you start looking at the tier twos and the tier threes who actually feed into the prime, they don't. And they don't necessarily need to also to be able to maximize the value, because the delivery chain for quantum is going to be very different to past compute eras, whereby you needed to buy the hardware, the software, etc. A lot of it is going to be cloud based. From a hardware perspective, there and getting access. So there's going to be a lot of easy access. So we believe one of the biggest pain points for advanced industrials is going to be actually the skills, the talent, the leadership, the governance, the skill sets that they're actually needing to maximize the value of quantum technologies. And that's where our embedded chief quantum officer actually comes into play. It's not one person, it's actually the whole company is the chief quantum officer that they're actually getting access to. When you look at the amount of physicists, quantum physicists and project management, quantum security specialists and everything you actually need, it can take years and years and millions of dollars to actually get that department actually up and running within an organization. So our niche going in is actually offering that embedded service for companies where they can have a chief quantum officer to actually help them maximize the value from quantum technologies and reduce risks from quantum technologies to get to that point where they're maximizing the value and risk reduction from it with our chief quantum officer model.
So essentially, they have two hats on. They're looking at quantum advantage overlay within the existing company structure, and they're looking at quantum safe migrations to move the company into a place where they're protected into the future.
Absolutely. And then that's what LFI's main goal is here, and what we're actually doing is helping companies on both of those two elements to maximize there's certain things they'll be able to do themselves, and that's great. But our job is to close the delta between what they can actually do themselves with the talents and skill set that they actually already have, and the maximum value proposition and risk reduction that we can actually there, and what's that delta between the two, and that's why what LFI exists to solve for customers.
Shayne, you've been across the industry for many years, so you've touched on semiconductors quite a bit, and now we've kind of slid into quantum advantage. When you look out over the next kind of 5-10 years, and we talk quantum advantage specifically, where do you see the economic gains coming in that space?
It's quite a lot, and first, before I answer that question, the whole terminology of quantum advantage, I think we're going to need to tighten up there, in terms of the definition of what quantum advantage is, in a lot in terms of quantum advantage in terms of cryptography, quantum advantage in terms of value, quantum advantage in terms of what that means overall for that particular industry. So I'm moving away from slowly using the terminology of quantum advantage, because one, it's overused, and two, it's understood by industry itself. It's become a bit of a catchphrase overall, but like, what is quantum advantage and if you're only talking going to quantum security, what is it, advantage on that then leaves a whole lot there. In industry also, as I was talking about, our nirvana or destination where we want to actually get to is industry 6.0. So in essence, that's our quantum advantage over time and what that actually looks like. So I just want to put a park on the whole usage of quantum advantage and the terminology and definition of quantum advantage. I think that's still being sorted. And I think in the next year, we'll see some more definition and less usage of that word. But now, coming back to your question in terms of value creation in the semiconductor industry, honestly, the semiconductor industry is already on the ball. There's actually a lot of pilots actually happening, whether it's in terms of new material discovery, their chemical uses, and everything that we're actually using for lithography. There's a whole lot, and also even in terms of new product development. In the semiconductor world, there's something called Moore's law, where everything doubles in terms of your transistors and in technology in there, and that's getting to the limit. So what would be interesting is with the introduction of both artificial intelligence and quantum, how much further we can push that, and that's going to be a really interesting concept that everybody's looking at. You hear people like, well, Moore's law is actually done in the semiconductors. It's not done. And I think AI and other technologies, and including quantum, is actually really going to squeeze every last drop out of what we can actually get from there. So I think there's a lot of use cases, and the companies that are already doing the pilots today are the ones that are going to get ahead and create that competitive moat over other companies as well there. So we're working on with quite a few right now in terms of pilots there, and it'd be great to be able to get to a point where we can actually talk about those particular use cases. And I think use cases are one of the biggest areas of interest that everybody wants to talk about today. Like, what's the use case? What's the economic value of that particular use case for an organization? And those companies that are actually getting in there early and doing that are trying to build that competitive moat today.
And I suppose we have to learn from the mistakes of AI, and every use case isn't going to derive instant value. Quite the opposite in most cases.
Not one fits all shoes as part of that as well.
Thanks, Shayne. Shayne, it's actually interesting to hear you kind of look at quantum advantage and say there's different perceptions of what it is, because I suppose from the work that I do quite a bit, we've quantum safe, which is post quantum migrations, or QKD between data centers or high value targets, and then you've quantum advantage, which is looking at the likes of HSBC's algo trading use cases to see can you shave seconds off transaction times, or looking at how you can use quantum computers to increase heuristics on models that then feed back into classical machines to get kind of an advantage in terms of statistical analysis for different use cases in financial or healthcare, etc. So that was, I kind of had two clear boxes, but now you've skewed them for me.
I was like, oh my God, music to my ears, love it.
Shayne, I want to ask you spent 15 years in Japan, if I'm correct, looking at your background. I'm always interested for people who kind of, take themselves out of where they are, go somewhere else. Did spending that time in Japan teach you anything about industrial competitiveness that Western executives often overlook?
Oh yeah, I think I left Australia when I was 17 to Japan and did my undergrad, and went straight into working for a Japanese company. So really, that first job, that first 20 in your 20s was all built in Japan, made in Japan. It's all I actually knew, and it wasn't until I actually started after Japan, I then spent quite a few years in Munich, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Hong Kong, back to Australia, and now last 12 years in the USA. But it wasn't until I left Japan that I realized the differences, and in terms of the competitive advantage of what's actually the Japanese way, and there's different eras of that as well. If you go back into the 80s, where Japan was going through the economic boom, then they hit the in the 1990s, they went into a 20-year almost depression, with the banking sector and everything. But just in terms of their impact on industry overall with your just-in-time manufacturing, or the different ways in terms of outlook. And I think just having a perspective and looking at things in a different way is very important. And then not necessarily saying one is better than the other, but having that perspective then to be able to drive business and drive economic outcome based on understanding maybe your perspective is biased sometimes, and maybe sometimes there's other avenues that you only know what you only know. So I think it's given me a nice, very rounded understanding, both from a cultural perspective, and ultimately at the end of the day, we're all dealing with people, and people just want to get on and do their jobs and enjoy them, what they're actually doing, but how they actually do it and how you actually can execute in different ways. I think there's many roads lead to Rome. Some get there to Rome faster than others, and just understanding which one is best for that particular scenario or case.
No, it's I like the kind of the grounding you get from this. I always talk to a lot of people who have spent portions of their career in different countries, and they get the same thing. It's kind of like it taught me to be a better communicator more so
Yeah,
than anything else, because you had to one work with a different culture, different language in some cases, and a different way of living, and that kind of brings its own perspectives, which
absolutely.
is
I mean, just
which
as an example there, like when I started my career in Japan, it was something, it was in Hiroshima, of all places. When you start back then with a Japanese company, and I was one of the few foreigners in the company, I think there was three of us altogether, but you start on the factory floor, and that was one of the things I can't say I enjoyed it at the time, but then I look back at it, and where you're actually on the factory floor, no matter what your role is in the company, you start on the factory floor where you're actually learning the machine, how the machine is actually built. You're actually building the machines, you're building the product, you're in there, you're bonding with the other factory workers that are actually in there and building the machine from the ground up. And I love that, in hindsight, of what that actually teaches you. And I think that's a very different perspective to the West on there, or, just, how to actually build that. I love that. I was, in the overalls on the shop floor in Hiroshima, in there with my toolkit, building the machines, and being down, going with the company, with that same company, and then was promoted into Munich, Germany. But having that perspective from the ground up, and you work your way from the bottom up, from getting the coffees and teas in the morning and being on the factory floor to your first roles in management and working through all of that. And I think that was incredibly useful. And as you said, perspective is all important in all of that.
Hindsight is fantastic. Like this is something I think we actually have lost. It came up. I was talking to Raheem Hirji a couple of weeks back on skills that survive AI, and a term he had that's kind of stuck with me was synthetic seniority.
Yeah.
And his whole premise was, we've got these people within organizations coming up with these brilliant ideas, but then when they go to execute them, they collapse. And when they collapse, they're nowhere to be seen because they actually don't understand where the idea came from, because it was AI generated. And like my background, I started out runner in the film industry, making teas and coffees, ended up in the edit suite, then pivoted into technology, spent time in the network stack, making up the cables and plugging them in, trying to figure out how the switches work. And now I'm obviously at the architecture and logical, but I can look back and go, something's broken down there, or there's something not quite right at layer whatever, or because my mind doesn't automatically go to the problem. It kind of goes dun 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 5 steps back and looks at the bigger picture. And I don't think you can get that if you've never had the pain of having to understand how that picture got painted, which is
You pinpointed the pain and understanding the pain. I think both from a customer perspective, but also from an internal perspective, is so important.
Yeah, I think we should bring back the work on the floor for a couple of years, even if you're in
Could you
in a
imagine
higher
that?
position.
I can't. The Gen Zs are like, hell no. I mean,
Here's a
I think
wrench. Yeah.
I'm now anyway.
Oh, I love it. Um, Shane, can we pivot into post quantum readiness or quantum safe for a minute? I'm interested to see your view because of the footprint of companies that you're dealing with in terms of how they're approaching their quantum readiness or their quantum safe migration plans, or even trying to understand what it is they need to do in that space. Because I'm assuming with manufacturing, you have a lot of OT and SCADA type
Massive.
devices hanging everywhere, which becomes a minefield.
25-year, 30-year equipment depreciation, and all of the above, absolutely. And similar to what I was talking about with quantum advantage, I also have problems with quantum readiness because once again on that as well, the terminology is not consistent on all of that. So, when we're talking, when we are talking quantum readiness, for us, that means we have all the plans and schematics for the bridge on what that actually looks like. That the right people are in the right place, that we actually understand technology, culture, security, governance, the skill set of that particular business, and actually having a full roadmap plan to go forward with both quantum security, PQC, and also value creation with quantum utility and quantum advantage on all of that. So that's just wanted to actually say that in terms of value, the terminology of, because that in the industry, both quantum readiness and quantum advantage, I think we've really got to hone in a little bit more on what that actually means. But in this case, I think we're talking, quantum security, PQC, cryptography, readiness as part of that. So there's varying degrees that we're actually seeing, and it's all going to be from the top down. So when we look at a company, let's say Lockheed Martin have close to, I think it's 14,000 suppliers. Your Airbus have close to 21,000 suppliers. Each of the different primes have got massive number of vendors, suppliers there. And each of them are at very different levels of readiness in terms of cryptography and being, crypto agile, let's say, and go with that particular word there. The primes are on it, but the primes are also trying to work out that their supplier base is their weakest link. And how do you get 13,000, 15,000, 20,000, 35,000 supplier base also in line and actually completing their migration? So this is one of the biggest questions that we're working on with these tier one primes, is like, how do you actually make that transition? What does that actually look like? So it's not just them, but it's all supplier base. And your tier ones are already starting that conversation and already going in that path. But if you talk about a tier two or tier three, when we're having conversations with them, even if they're in the semiconductor or aerospace or defense areas, they've still got government mandates and compliance requirements, and they've also got their customer, their primes or their primes requirements on them. So there's varying degrees of requirements on them right now that they're trying to understand. What does even just the government mandates mean for them? What does their prime, the customer mandates mean for them? And how do they then, how can they do that? And when do they need to do it by? And what's the cost of actually doing that? So there's a lot of questions being asked in terms of that. And in terms of readiness, there's massive degrees of zero readiness to your primes being probably 40% ready and there and understanding all of that. Obviously, the primes have got all the resources, they've got all the budget, they've got all of that in place. But that doesn't help them, from a vendor base when you've got so many different vendors. That's huge issue that we were all still working through right now. And how do we actually get collectively everybody there? With the technology, we're still getting the standards are migrating. We've got our 3 from NIST, and then there's another 9 on their way, and which ones are actually when? Great feedback coming from so many great people out there in the industry, whether it's Cloudflare. We work very closely with the great Brian Cousins as well, who's got a lot of different opinions. So there's a lot of movement out there in the industry. And our job at LFI is to create clarity in chaos, because it is chaos right now, and helping him to create that clarity in amongst all that chaos that's happening.
When you say 20,000 suppliers or vendors, I gotta kind of it's like
absolutely.
like why such a sprawl? Is there an opportunity for consolidation there, or is this just like some guy makes a bolt and some other guy makes a tire and some other guy makes, like, how much of that base is network connected or infrastructure connected or direct exposure? Like how do you even start? Like this is bringing me back to my cryptographic bill of materials problem of, create a C bomb. And I'm like, no, don't create a C bomb. Create a mapping of your high exposure systems with long lived data and start there. Don't scan everything and everywhere and end up with a million problems that you don't know where to start. So I suppose that how do you turn the million problems or the 20,000 suppliers into 5, 10, 15 of exposure level? This has schematics or drawings or sensitive IP. These guys create really custom, software. Did it like that's well, Shayne.
I bet you're flustered. Sorry. No, it is a huge issue that we're talking with and we're working through at the moment. But I think you hit the nail on the head when you said exposure. Your profile, what's the end priority on there? Where's the biggest exposure today? And generally, how can we, sort of like the 80-20 rule, can we close 80% of that exposure in the first 12 months of 80% of the vendors, of the supply chain, and then work through the remaining 20% on there, depending on that exposure, on what that actually looks like. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to reduce risk once again in the shortest amount of time in the best possible way, for both the prime and the whole supply base. And what does that look like?
Yeah, I don't envy you. Would probably be my takeaway there. Shayne, before we finish up, I was reading that you wrote a book and it had some interesting perspectives on it. Maybe not specifically a quantum specific rendition, but interesting nonetheless. I'm always interested to hear when people have lived a career and then actually taking the time to sit down and get that on paper. I've great admiration for that because I think I could have 30 books started here, but to get to chapter 1 and then I get another problem and I move on. So I haven't actually managed to complete anything with any level of
you'll get there
so far. So like that process or that need, was it a need to get an idea down on paper? Was it something just was a side hobby that materialized and then came to life? Like what was your process around creating a group, and what was the purpose of getting it out there?
Yeah, so I wrote Strategic Entanglement, and published last year with the goal. When I've been going to a lot of quantum conferences, there's incredible ideas, innovation coming through in different startups all around the world. But the one area that they always get stuck on is commercialization. They're coming from amazing universities, academics, and but everyone is it's called the Valley of Death. Where technology goes to die, and you have there, and I could see the same thing, working through, and when I started my career in the semiconductor business, and then putting analogies between the semiconductor industry and also then the quantum industry. I was just like, God, I don't want people to make the same mistakes we made way back then. And started putting down, some lessons learned, let's say, and once again, making me sound like an old man, but like lessons learned from what we did in the semiconductor industry to actually, accelerate the growth of that particular industry of a particular product from in the deep tech. So it's all about a playbook to archetype new markets and create beliefs in, quantum and deep tech. And it's been really well received. It's actually now one of the textbooks for the Quantum Australia New Venture Program, and teaching it there. But it was also just merely for me to be able to help stop people from making the same mistakes that I did way back when in the semiconductor industry, and then being able to help accelerate, because we're talking about those industrial eras getting shorter and shorter. We don't have the time to be making the same mistakes that we made back then. And not to say that it's a one-to-one comparison as well, but I wanted to jot down those experiences and help those new startups that are coming through with these incredible innovative ideas in quantum, to accelerate their journey to commercialization success.
Can you give me one or two of the key takeaways from that book, if you can?
Oh, it's quite a lot, but there's every, strategic entanglement, these are in terms of the actual naming that obviously it's a play from, on the whole quantum entanglement that we were actually talking about there. But there's two parts that within a business, they need to be actually connected. In there. And there's certain elements, both the commercialization generally is always thought of at a last level, or marketing is at the last level, and just in terms of that. And then my point being that it needs to be upfront, and actually driving it. There's certain levels of things that are not being done by the startups that should be done to help them, create the market, the narrative, and especially in deep tech. It's very interesting because a lot of the time your deep tech startups are building a product that doesn't exist yet or won't exist for another 5 or 10 years. And so I use some case studies in there. Some, for example, PsiQuantum, who have been able to create a massive investment with no product. Though they've been able to create this narrative in the market on what they're building, and they've got a lot of people behind them, to their credit, that they've been able to build on something that we'll probably see in about 5 years' time what that actually looks like. But how did they create that narrative? How did they create that belief to be able to get the investment that they actually needed from all of that? And not to say that there's all roads, there's multiple ways to actually get there. Quantinuum did it in a very different way. And there, so I try to use a lot of use cases in the book to be able to show, the different methods that different companies, and existing companies that are using today in deep tech and quantum to help them, drive commercialization, get investment, and actually accelerate the whole process.
Super interesting. I'm gonna have to procure a copy now, Shayne, to read this in more detail. So I will. Shayne, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Thanks for joining me today. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure the listeners got a lot out of it as well.
The pleasure was mine. I look forward to continuing sometime soon. Thanks so much, Francis.
Thank you.